Welcome back to Startups for the Rest of Us. This is the show where we focus on bootstrapping and mostly bootstrapping SaaS companies. Today, I sit down with my TinySeed co-founder, Einar Vollset, and we talk through 5 insights SaaS founders should know about AI, about OpenAI, ChatGPT, LLMs, all the things you're probably kind of tired of hearing about. But here's the different tact that we took that I'm not hearing other podcasts and other pundits make on this topic. I tried to put a mental framework around AI that SaaS founders would understand. It's how I would be thinking about this if I were a startup founder. And frankly, it's how I'm advising my almost 150 investments to be thinking about this. So I kick it off by going through 4 categories of AI. So we had some taxonomy to think about. And I talk about generative, categorization, summarization, and predictive. And then we walk through 5 things that I think you as a founder should be thinking about. If you're putting your head in the sand and thinking AI is not going to change everything, that's a problem because it's going to change quite a few things. But before we dive into that, tickets for MicroConf Europe this October are available for sale. microconf.com/Europe. MicroConf Europe is in Lisbon, October 1st through the 3rd. Speakers include Michelle Hansen of Geocodio, Sherry Walling of ZenFounder, myself, Stephen Innala-Craven of Stridist, and several others yet to be announced. It's going to be an amazing event. Tickets are already flying off the shelves, as they say. microconf.com/Europe if you're interested. And with that, let's dive into my conversation with Einar Vollset on 5 insights SaaS founders should know about AI. Einar, thanks for coming back on the show.
Glad you have me.
It is awesome. We're going to be digging into AI today. Obviously talking about things that SaaS founders, whether bootstrapped or not, really should be thinking about. I want to kick it off by maybe giving folks an idea of how you've been digging into AI, how you're thinking about it, and how much you've been screwing around with it, in essence. You've been doing internal presentations to TinySeed companies. Like, of all the people I know, you're one of the people who has given it the most thought, so to speak.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I sort of started looking at it, I guess, in August or September last year, and it wasn't really on my radar all that much. I have to be perfectly honest. We've invested in a couple of AI companies or companies that used AI. It was a key part of it back in, I guess, 21. And I nearly did my PhD on AI, which actually looking back at it, I'm kind of glad that I didn't, because looking back, it was a bit of a terrible time to have done your PhD on AI. But it sort of started coming definitely to the forefront in the fall. And particularly with ChatGPT, it became very evident to me that this was probably one of the bigger shifts in terms of a technical capability that would impact startups. I think at the very least, the biggest comparative change that I've seen was probably when the iPhone was launched. And I think it's definitely a bigger shift than that, and potentially as big as the internet becoming a sort of a commercially viable thing to do. So I started really digging into it. I thought, AI is an interesting thing. People have weird reactions to it, and there are sort of the doomsters out there who are we should just call in airstrikes whenever the loss function falls too much. But equally, I think a little bit more of the sort of considered concern meant if you can just ask the AI to do everything, why do you even need SaaS companies anymore? Why do you need all this stuff? So I started digging into it quite deeply, probably sort of November, December timeframe. And it became evident to me that this was something that we needed to, both for the portfolio for TinySeed, but also for the work that I do with Discretion Capital. We needed to lean into it. And sort of probably most of my experimentation to date and sort of the systems that we've been building has been augmenting our systems for Discretion Capital in terms of using AI to sort of understand the SaaS, specifically the B2B SaaS market worldwide. And that has allowed us to basically have a step change. We're basically gone from tracking the number of SaaS companies that we're tracking and what they're doing and all this stuff is probably gone from 10% of the market to nearly 100%. So it's an order of magnitude change. And it's been key to me to try to understand, obviously that's a huge benefit to us, but also I wanted to understand how it would impact our portfolio at TinySeed, because we're invested in so many companies. I felt there's probably at least a third, if not more, which there could be a severe competitive impact on the stuff. So I started digging into it. I haven't, like, most of my focus has not been so much on the sort of visual models, like the stable diffusions and DALL-Es and stuff, but mostly on the sort of large language models like ChatGPT or Flan T5 coming out of Google, and just trying to understand, like, okay, how does this impact? How can we do this? There's an odd dynamic in the AI world, I feel like, because it's like, on one hand, you have people who think it'll be like just snap your fingers and it'll take over the world. And on the other hand, you have people who are like, oh, this is just autocomplete. It's bullshit. Like, why even bother with it? This is like, the most standard thing I hear is like, oh, this is Web 3.0 once again. It's like NFT craze. And I'm like, brother, it's not NFT craze. Like, whatever it is, it's not that. So yeah, that's been my angle. Like I said, my academic background is very much on sort of the systems applied side. And so trying to understand, reading a lot of papers and trying to understand, like, what can it do? What can it not do? What are best practices? And like you say, also trying to get the TinySeed portfolio companies up to speed as fast as possible in terms of understanding what they can expect.
Right. And there's a certain amount of just learning what it can do and not do, as you're saying. And then in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, trying to get a head around what might it be able to do at that point, then taking that and viewing it through the lens of SaaS companies, whether funded or not, right? I mean, that's what we're trying to do internally. For folks who don't know, you mentioned Discretion Capital. That is the sell-side M&A firm where you help SaaS companies between 1 and 20 million ARR exit, right? You run processes. So a bunch of SaaS companies, tens of thousands, literally, private equity companies, all this stuff that you do with that. So they know why, both TinySeed and Discretion Capital, and frankly, MicroConf and this podcast has an interest in this topic. It's because I keep saying, ignore AI at your peril. I've heard the same thing about, is this the next Web3? Is this the next whatever other technology had a big hype cycle and then flamed out? Yes, there's a big hype cycle. But I think this is much more like no code, where no code had a hype cycle and people were like, I don't know, it doesn't really, it's always just code. You have these witty retorts, but like no code is changing things at a grassroots level. It's changing things for a lot of people. AI is going to do that times 100. I think you and I are both in agreement on that.
100%. I mean, to give you an idea, like, it's rare, like the whole NFT thing, like that didn't, like my normie friends in Europe, that's usually like my standard measure of like, how do people interact with technology? And my normie friends in Europe, like they never even heard of NFTs. Like it was like a what? Like, who cares about this rent Ethereum? Like, who gives a shit? No code, what? I don't care. But like ChatGPT, it was like, immediately I was talking to my brother once, and he's like, oh yeah, crap. Like normally it would take us like 3-4 weeks to write this report that we charge a bunch of money for. And actually, yeah, it can be done in 2 days now. Like real people are seeing real impact. And I think if you have technical founders who are like sticking their head in the sand about the capability that's just become available, I think that's a massive, massive mistake, a huge mistake.
Yeah, my brother runs a construction firm in the Bay Area. And similarly, he and I talked about it for 20 minutes and I started showing him. I was like, it's not like construction is the most high-tech industry, but he was telling me about briefs he has to write or things he has to summarize or things he has to consume, or you know what I mean? It's just the moment we got into text, I was like, oh, well, let's just, give me that in a PDF so I can copy paste it right into ChatGPT and just ask it some questions, Yeah. And was it 100% right? No. But will it be 100% right in the next 3, 6, 12, whatever? It's going to get there, right? So
it's going to get there. And like, I think a lot of the time, like technical founders, they underestimate how much of the world economy consists of people who take bits of text and produce bits of text and give it to other people. And those people produce other bits of text depending on the inputs of that bits of text. That's a lot of the economy in the world.
Yeah. It's crazy. So when you said your normie friends, so I use the term muggles. Oh, my muggle friends. You know that? It's from Harry Potter. Yeah, in the wizarding school, right? The muggles are like the normies who don't have magic. Anyways, I want to kick it off. I put together an outline of my thoughts. The reason I wanted to have you on is I could totally have done a solo episode around this, right? But I want someone who knows more about it than I am to say, I disagree. Oh, I do agree. Oh, I agree, plus.
I'm happy to disagree, Rob, always.
Oh, I know. That's to derail the podcast is your goal. All right, so I have been trying to get my head around kind of the categories of AI that this does not capture everything in the world, but as I've seen uses of ChatGPT and DALL-E, the OpenAI API, I realized, I think that in my head, there are 4 categories is the only word I can come up with. But the first is generative. This is where you type in something and it spits something out. So that's like create an outline for a YouTube video titled How to Invest in Bootstrap Startups. And then it just does an outline, right? It creates it based on its predictive stuff. Or you can type into DALL-E, you can type in, create a picture of Einar Vollset with a San Francisco Giants hat on. Ooh, no, who's your, with a White Sox? Who would be that would be great. The Dodgers. Oh, yeah, no. Ooh, all right. Note to self, putting it on my Trello board. Create a picture of Einar Vollset with a Dodgers hat on, right? And waving a big foam finger that says, I love Tommy Lasorda. Am I in the wrong decade? Is that not?
I don't even know who that is. So that sounds good to me.
Ooh, it's a deep cut. For people who watched baseball in the 80s, they totally know what I'm talking about. But anyways, that's what I'm calling generative AI, is generating things. Second one is categorization. Like if I feed it 1,000 URLs, can it tell me which of these is an e-commerce website versus an agency versus a SaaS app? And then the third I have is summarization, which is a little bit, you could call this generative, but I'm breaking it out because I'm having ChatGPT and other tools summarize a YouTube video and try to turn it into a tweet thread, for example. So there's a summary and there's a bit of generation. And then the fourth one I have is predictive. And this is one where internally I think we've talked or brainstormed. It's like, well, could you input all the inputs of all the successful masterminds that we've matched in MicroConf? And then when the new batch comes in, you put those inputs in and have it try to predict what we should match, because that matching process is extremely manual right now. And I don't know that we have enough data. And we've matched 1,000 founders. If we had 1 million, I would say we have enough data, but I just don't know there's enough that it could do it. So those are kind of the four things: generative, categorization, summarization, and predictive. I've gone to Google and tried to type in, like, what are the types of AIs? What are the categories of AI, to try to get someone much smarter than me has thought about it in this way, but I don't seem to be able to find it. Do you have thoughts? Do you feel like I'm on base there? Any other types that I'm missing?
No, I think that's reasonably fair. I probably think of it slightly differently. I think in general, there is this notion. I mean, in general, everything is generative. Fundamentally, a lot of the text models are just they're extremely flexible APIs. Basically, it's just text in, text out. So, that's true. I mean, I think as a broad classes, the way I think about it, there's sort of classification, which are sort of similar to predictions, where it's here's something, which bucket does this fall into? It could be anything. It could be is this URL a SaaS app like we do for Discretion Capital? Or it's like you say, given this background, does this person fall into this or that mastermind fit? I think that's true. I think summarization is probably also one of the key ways to basically get value very quickly. And one of the key things there is, it's remarkable to me, like you were saying, when you were talking to your brother, it's remarkable to me how often you can just sort of put dirty data in there and it'll just sort of clean it up and figure it out. You could take raw HTML, messed up JavaScript from a website, dump it in there and say, hey, give me what does this business do? Give me the summarize of what this page is. Even though if you were to do that with pre-LLMs, then that would be kind of a pain in the ass to do. And I think for me, that's one of the key mind shifts that this technology does. It's basically programming in general is extremely precise, right? Math is very precise. Programming is very precise. I mean, it's if you want to interact with text, you better clean up your text. It better be in a specific format. Ideally, it's in a table of some kind. You normalize the data, you deal with it. And it's much easier as a programmer to deal with exact numbers and things than it is to deal with different various corpus of text. And I think that's probably one of the main things to sort of keep in mind when you're thinking about use cases, is that it's it effectively gives you sort of new sort of fuzzy tools. So it sort of gives you a way to grasp at, in a sort of a fuzzy, imprecise way, grab text and text formats and get value from that in a way that is almost impossible to do in a generic way before. Because before you had to handle every side case and every possible, whatever, versus with these tools, you can sort of just roughly grab some text and kind of indicate the sort of thing that you want to be able to do. And it'll sort of refine it and, like you say, summarize it and put it into a more valuable format where you can interact with it. And in fact, one of the most precise formats and one of the most interesting things is this things around embedding. So I think that's sort of the next step that people, get to. They start playing with it and they do the thing, and then they sort of go, okay, how do I represent many of this thing? And being able to take extremely diverse textual, maybe dirty text sources and turn it into a very concise textual representation of something that contain information, or even better, like an embedding that you can embed in a database and do things like vector search on. I think that's one of the key things to really understand when you're trying to think about the use cases and how it applies to your SaaS.
Yeah, and that's why it's helpful for me to have these categories of what it can do, even if they're all generative. You're right. They're all just generative. Yeah. But as I break it down, but I'm thinking as a founder, let's say I ran an email service provider today, or I ran a CRM. I would want to say, when do I ask my users to generate text or to generate images? Well, obviously when they're writing an email, what are they getting that email from? Are they just trying to summarize something else? So should I build a summarization engine into my ESP, right? Or in my CRM, when I type in the URL of my contact, the sales lead, shouldn't AI maybe try to categorize that? Because that's my second category, right? Categorize it and say, hey, is this an e-commerce company? Yeah. Or even pull in a summary or write a summary of like, this company does the XYZ in 3 sentences such that the sales rep doesn't have to do that. So having those 4 categories, and again, I'm not saying, if we listen to this in a year, I bet we'll be like, oh yeah, those categories were off. But I think they're close. And I think it's a model of if I was running a SaaS app today, I would apply each of those 4, generative, categorization, summarization, and predictive, to say where in the app would my users benefit from it doing one of those, or where do I ask them to do it today that AI can at least give them a start?
And I agree with that. And I think it sort of relates to some of the other ways that I think about it. And like what I tell TinySeed founders too is like, it's important given this new capability to not just, it's completely the wrong approach to think that this is just NFTs and stick your head in the sand. Like that is fundamentally wrong. Like I'll take an argument with anybody who thinks that. But even if you think it's like this is something that is great and you want to utilize, I think it's such a big change in capability that it's always behooves you to sort of take a step back and look at the businesses that you have and the customers that you have and the use cases and the problems that you're solving for your customers, and take like a big sort of step back and sort of get up to the sort of 30,000 feet level and think about what are the sort of jobs to be done that generically for my customers, and like what is now possible given that this capability exists that didn't exist like a year or two ago. Like, what can I do differently? I think some people will end up not getting the most of this or sort of be left by the wayside because they're a little bit too close to their existing solution. Like, they're like, oh, I'll just add a chat bot to my thing, or like we can do this. And it becomes very hard to build any kind of defensive mode around that, because it's like anyone can add a chat. Like chat might be like, there's got to be like, at one point I was looking at Product Hunt and it was like, every single thing except like 2 things on that day's Product Hunt was chat to my PDF docs. Like it's like 12 different ones. It's like, yeah, okay. Exactly. Well, this is the tutorial case for almost all large language models. Like, come on, like this can't be, this is not a product. This is like an auxiliary thing. And it's important that you take a step back and say, okay, what problems can I now, maybe I can solve the same problems or bigger problems for my customers than what I was able to do before.
Yeah, that's our first point, really. I have 5 points in an outline today. We may do more, depending on other thoughts you have. But really, the first one is to take those 4 categories that we've just talked about and ask yourself where each of them could be applied to your SaaS, to help your customers, to just make it better, right? Is to kind of mental model. And as you said, the obvious ideas of putting a chat bot is not going to be enough. My second thought, or the second point that I've realized, ties right into what you just said with the chat PDF and how 8 out of 10, on Product Hunt were that. Unless you build something novel that is non-obvious and relatively difficult to build, AI is not a differentiator. If all you're doing is engineering a prompt and you can build it in a weekend, even though it can do something totally fucking cool, anyone else can do that next weekend, right? That's a big mistake. Everyone can use it. The obvious ideas, again, summarizing XYZ or building a chat for your PDF, there are going to be hundreds of those. So you have to go further and think about moats are still moats, and 5 hours of code is not a moat.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. I think like basically the key thing to think about in terms of how I think about founders and their SaaS businesses is, like you say, I think it's important not just to think, hey, don't just stick your head in that. Like if it's 2 hours worth of work and it adds a really cool capability to your app, you should definitely do that. Like like it's a mistake not to, but you can't think that that's like a competitive advantage, like an additional moat than what you currently have. What you really want to be doing, I think, is to say, okay, I have my moat, Like, how can I further add to it with AI? And I think like if you don't do that, if there's some obvious stuff that people eventually will come around to realizing, oh, we should add this capability that the LLM gives us to the problem domain that you're working in. If you don't do that, then someone else will. And like someone may come out of sort of left field, and basically because you sort of like refuse to sort of go with the times and sort of add this capability to your product, then that might be a competitive advantage for someone else because they choose to do it and you refuse to do so. There's going to be some failure modes there where people are like sticking their head in the sand about this and being like, oh, it doesn't matter, like whatever. I think not a lot of people, but some people are going to get outcompeted by this low-hanging fruit. But the flip side is, like you say, the low-hanging fruit isn't in itself a moat.
It's more an accelerant. It becomes, I think of it, I mean, there's a ton of examples we could use, but like, remember when Rails came out for Ruby?
Yeah.
And somebody, I don't remember if it was DHH or someone on the team there, built Twitter, like a small version of Twitter, MVP version, in like 20 minutes on a video. And people were like, oh my gosh, now I can build Twitter in 20 minutes. And it's like, yeah, that's cool. That's no longer a differentiator. Like the code to build that. And so if you were still writing Ruby with no Rails and building web apps, suddenly you were way slower than everyone else. And in fact, if you were using, I mean, there's a reason Laravel came out with PHP, Django came out with Python, because those languages became much, much slower than Ruby at building web apps. And so it's an accelerant. It feels like, oh my gosh, I'm ahead of everyone, but it's like everyone else can use this too.
Yeah. I mean, it's true. And the way to think about it, like I used the iPhone example early on, this is almost like, which I know is strange. It's almost like you can sort of like, if you have a web app, you can flip lick your fingers, and all of a sudden you have a native mobile app that works. And like, that's what it's like. And if you think about it like that, it's like, well, it's so easy just to add a mobile app. You just, click your fingers and you have it. So it's not a moat. But if you don't do that, someone else will. And then that will be a competitive advantage for them.
It becomes table stakes in the space, right?
Yeah.
All right. So that was the second point. The third thing, I'm curious if you agree with me on this, but I wrote this out. The big AI ideas, like trying to build your own models, your own LLMs, and the massive horizontal plays, right? Like building a search engine with AI. It's like, these are big, these are going to be billion and billion dollar companies. I think those are already done. They're going to be won by OpenAI, by Google, by Microsoft, by Facebook, IBM, whoever else gets into it. These players are so massive and so well funded that if you're a mostly bootstrap company like the SaaS we see, it's just too big. What do you think about that?
I agree with that. I mean, like, so for example, like one of the things that I have running in my local MacBook is I've taken Google Takeout, so exported all my email from all my email accounts, and basically created a chatbot that allows me to talk to about my email. So I can ask like, okay, when did I meet so-and-so? Or like, who are the people that I talked to after I went to this conference? That sort of thing. It's very, very cool. But do I think it's a standalone business? Do you think it's a good business for a bootstrapper to start? No, because it's such an obvious thing for like the big email providers just to add out of the box. Like I'm almost a little shocked that Google hasn't already added a way for you to interact with Gmail that is like that. And so that's effectively like, I think the big players will take the low-hanging fruits and sort of accelerate on their way and sort of add to the existing competitive moat. So I wouldn't want to start like an AI email startup type client. That doesn't make any sense, at least not for like a bootstrap type business. Now, if you're at Neumann and you raised like $1 gazillion, sure, go for it. But most people aren't like that. They don't necessarily do that. So yeah, I 100% agree with that. I still think the same is sort of true for search. Now, some of these big, hairy ideas that are like, once you understand what it does and understand the technology, then it's sort of an obvious idea. If it's an obvious idea in a huge competitive market with large incumbents, you know what? Those guys are going to take that. They're going to own that piece. And so like building your startups around that and thinking like, oh, I'm smarter, I'm more nimble, I'm doing whatever. I'm like, you know what? Like connecting Gmail's data with OpenAI's APIs and calling that your startup, that's not a competitive moat. That's not going to work for you. You have to go after like, what is your existing mode? What is something new, like something completely new that is not, it doesn't require people to change, that sort of behavior in order to be for you to be successful.
Or like we talked about above, you have existing moats probably within your company today, and using AI to make your product better is a way to extend those and accelerate. Point 4 that I'd like to communicate is In addition to thinking about how AI can be integrated into your product as features, right, which was point one, I think most SaaS founders and frankly, most entrepreneurs should probably be using AI internal to their company. Whether you're doing content marketing and you're trying to repurpose a YouTube video to Twitter or a YouTube video to a blog post, whether you say draft a cold email based on my homepage to this type of buyer and have it give you a 101. Oh no, that's not funny enough, right? I mean, you can go back and forth with it. To help outline YouTube videos, I will admit some of the YouTube videos that I'm putting out, I go to ChatGPT and say, outline a video, 12 best business books to read this year, blah, blah, blah. But then I'll say, nope, not good enough, regenerate. It's not even 50% for me. It's probably 25% I use, or a third of what it gives me. But it helps get me outside of my own box, right? So we're using it for content generation. And I feel like small software companies especially really took advantage of, like, when virtual assistants were $5 an hour in 2008, like that was a game changer for my little company at the time. And I think that if you're not using AI in your own internal workflows, again, this is not building it as a feature in your app, but helping it make you faster, I think it's something that you should be thinking about. What do you think?
Yeah, 100% agree with that. I mean, I think the obvious case where this applies immediately is code. Like, I don't write code anymore without AI helping me out. And I probably do only about 20 or 30% of the typing. Like, it just moves faster. Like, I don't bother, like, if I have a new Python library that I need to figure out how to use, I don't bother trying to ask Stack Overflow anymore. I just am like, I don't read the docs. My standard thing is like, hey, I want to use this library in Python. Can you write me up some code to do it? Like, for example, like, I wanted some visualization code. I've never been good at the visualization code. And I was like, okay, because they're all kind of complex, like they're a pain in the ass to deal with visualization stuff. So I was just like, I was asking ChatGPT, hey, can you visualize these, 2,000 embeddings for me, or these, whatever it was. And it just did it. It was like, yeah, just cut and paste this stuff in here, make sure you pip install this library. And boom, it was doing the visualization, the three-dimensional visualization that I wanted to do without me having to really ever look outside ChatGPT to understand how the library works. And I think that applies. I also think it's like, if you're in a profession or part of your thing is where you're generating, text, for example, like reports and things like that internally, like you're at a massive disadvantage if you're not using that. Like anything that you're outsourcing to your VA, or you have like some medium level employee write text for, like that stuff you should probably be looking at. How can I augment this capability with like an LLM?
I have a caveat to this one, and I'm curious to bat it around with you just a little bit. It kind of relates to this one plus the first point about building features into SaaS. But I feel like not every SaaS app itself needs or can use AI inside of it as a feature. But I do think every SaaS company or every SaaS founder can be using it internally. Pretty much everyone internally has something they can use ChatGPT or AI for. But I was trying to think of examples, and I mean, there isn't a great use case for it. Like, what about Ruben's company Signwell, right? It's electronic signature. How could AI be integrated in that? Because I can't think of a great example off the top of my head.
Sure, I can.
Okay.
Hi, Ruben. Basically, you have a company. It signs a bunch of documents, a bunch of contracts. How does the company keep track of its obligations that it signed? How does it know that?
You mean what's in the documents, like knowing what it's? Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. So it becomes a knowledge base.
All the contracts that are given. Contract management. Like Ruben can turn into a contract management. You can add a contract management capability to Signwell. It could be like, yeah, part of the thing, you sign this contract, and like it says when you're going to get paid. Summarizes, your obligations to the client. Did you meet this? Yes or no? It understands every commitment you've made and can summarize it for you. So yeah, no,
I like that. This is why
that's a good example. There might be, but that particular case,
I like
definitely,
that
I can.
Yeah. How about let's do one more and then we'll move on. I think in the world there is a percentage that won't use them, but it's probably pretty small.
I'm sure.
Yeah, but what about like SavvyCal, right? Derek Reimer startup scheduling link competes with Calendly. Like
absolutely, I want to be able to talk about my SavvyCal links. Like, okay, hey, summarize what did I do with my, how many times have I talked to this person before? When was the last time I talked to these people? Like it's like unstructured, semi-structured data about what I did with my days that can be generated in text. Absolutely, you can use that, built in. And actually, like it ties into one of the things I haven't done. Like I mentioned, my email is a good example of like how I'm using it to talk to my inbox. One of the things that I'm not doing that's kind of the low-hanging fruit there too is like I want to be able to integrate it into my calendar and just say, so I emailed this person that and that date. And also, by the way, I chatted to them, I had a Zoom call with them on such and such a date. That should be part of the information that sort of summarizes into what I'm doing. So yeah, I think both those two have pretty large language model use cases.
Cool. So let's move on from there to the fifth point. And this is one I'm sure you've thought about. So I'm curious. I think we both agree on it. But the question here that I would ask myself as a founder is my business model a ticking time bomb? Because some businesses are, if you're a big team of analysts presenting data and you're doing a bunch of manual work and you're summarizing things like that, it becomes, like you said, what was it? The 3-week report becomes a 2-day thing. Well, once anyone can do that, that's a problem, right? So how should founders, what should they be thinking about? And how can you escape that, right? How can you not let your business basically be completely deprecated by AI in those cases? It's not everybody, but there is a subset of SaaS out there.
There are. And I think the use cases where you have, again, maybe before a part of your moat was, this is really dirty data. It's hard to deal with. It's imprecise. It requires verification. So you end up outsourcing to a call center in the Philippines, or not a call center, but outsourcing, overseas, and you're paying people to do textual analysis or updating reports manually because it's super hard to do with the existing technology. I think that particular model, if that was my moat, if that's what I did, I would be worried. I don't necessarily think it's here's the thing. It sort of relates to what LLMs are bad at. You can't have it, people say, I can't do, math. They can't do 2 times to the power 8 times whatever 6, whatever, right? That does not, but that's what it does. That's just a calculator. It doesn't matter. That's what it's good at. What it's also, another thing it's not good at is queries give me all the whatever it is in the world. It doesn't do well at that, just because that's not what it's good at. That's not being able to iterate every row in a database is not something that it's really good at. And so I think the moat that exists from building out and managing and quality assurance on a team of people in the Philippines, say, I think that's going to go away. But that doesn't mean I think that the entirety of those businesses are just 3 lines of code in ChatGPT anymore. It just becomes a different moat. And if you lean then too heavily on that existing moat, then I think you'll be outcompeted. But I think a lot, sort of what I'm saying is for those kind of businesses, it makes sense to sit down and say, okay, let's just admit that this particular thing is no longer a moat. What can we do, given the capabilities that we already have and the customer relationships and the understanding on how we get that data? What can we build? It's almost you kind of if you've been sort of cruising along on that moat by yourself, you're going to be in trouble.
Right. And I'm here less to be, what do you call it, doom and gloom. The world is not over. I mean, we are in, as entrepreneurs, we are in the best spot possible, one of the best spots possible to take advantage of this. This is exactly, I keep likening it back to having a VA for $5 an hour, because in 2007 and 8, I was running these very small businesses. I didn't have huge budgets, and I was either writing all the code myself and I was doing all the support myself, because the only people I knew lived where I did in LA, and I paid developers $75 an hour, and I paid admins $30 an hour, and I had no profit margin. And then when I read the 4-hour work week, I was like, what? I can do that? And so I did. And it made my $3,000 a month .NET invoice suddenly be a 90% profit margin business. And that changed the game for me. And that's when I realized, I can do this. So I think AI is that plus. Right? I think it's even more different. And I was in a position, and at the time people were like, oh no, offshoring, outsourcing, all Americans are going to have no jobs. And I was like, A, that's not true. And B, a lot of us, knowledge workers and developers and entrepreneurs, are at a great place to take advantage of it. So that's my mental model of this.
I agree. I mean, I think it's an amazing time to be alive. And it's also an amazing time to be the kind of bootstrap or nearly bootstrap software entrepreneur, because even just being aware that this sort of exists and being able to write code that can call an API, that can do some stuff, that's an amazing, you're heads and shoulders above, your average Joe. And I think doom and glooming on it is completely pointless. It's going to change our lives, I think, mostly for the better. And having an optimistic view of where this is going to go, and have it be this is amazing. What cool things can I do now? I think is the right attitude, as opposed to the sort of doomer, like, oh, old SaaSes are going to go away, everything's going to hell, and then, by the way, the AI will take over and murder us all.
Right. And look, is there a spot to say, will people lose jobs, and, will it have social impact, especially on just the lower end of data processing, data entry, whatever? Yeah, there is. This is not the podcast where we talk about that kind of stuff, but it certainly could have an impact, right? So as a listener, hopefully that was helpful to hear Einar and my thoughts on this. Obviously, we have, I would say, a relatively unique perspective, being invested in a lot of companies and just being knee-deep in SaaS, day in and day out. If folks want to keep up with you, you are Einar Vollset on Twitter. And we mentioned Discretion Capital at discretioncapital.com, as well as TinySeed. Of course, that's what we work on together.
Indeed.
Thanks again for joining me, man.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Einar for joining me this week. And thanks to you for joining me every week. I'll be back in your earbuds again next Tuesday. This is Rob Walling signing off from episode 663.